In the UK, our neighbours often live too close to home.
Come and speak to me.
So it's no surprise 1 in 5 of us have been in an argument with next door. Coming up, a canine dispute turns nasty in Scotland.
He says they were howling from 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning.
And a Midlands couple are terrorised by their neighbour's bizarre behaviour.
I said, God, this is a terrible smell. I said, it's just like somebody's chucked some urine.
I'd hear it coming up straight over our fence. Look at that, disgusting.
In rural Leicestershire, back in 2003, neighbours in one quiet cul-de-sac enjoyed a tranquil and simple life.
They're really quite good now, aren't they, the dahlias and the fuchsias?
3 families, the Walns, the Pollards and the Elliots, had become good friends.
You've got to get that out. You got to make the loan then.
You know, good neighbours, good friends again, and the kind of neighbours that you want.
Next to the Pollards and across from the Walns lived Leslie Collins.
Mr. Collins has never been the perfect neighbour, but he was a reasonable neighbour. He went to work and we went to work. It wasn't somebody who'd invite you to go round and have a cup of tea with him or a pint of beer or anything like that, but it was reasonable, you could live with him.
But when Mr. Collins, a carpenter by trade, began spending more and more time at home, things began to change for the worse.
It was always the 2-finger salute. We thought this was funny. We just ignored it, but it went on and on.
I've seen him in the garden when it can be really calm, and then the next thing, it's just like the balloon's gone up. He's shouting and ranting and raving.
As long as you kept out his way, then things were okay.
Although the neighbours tried to live peacefully side by side, as the weeks went by, it wasn't just Colin's rude behaviour that upset them.
He'd bring these pallets and he'd pile them all up on his drive. So when I'm looking out my lounge window, all I'm looking at is these piles of pallets and waste wood. It was like a wood yard.
It looked to the Pollards like their next-door neighbour had started a wood recycling business.
The noise it's like a sawmill going really. He's got a power saw. It's just going all the time. Well, the noise is so bad that we can't sit in the lounge. We have to go into the kitchen or we have to go out. A lot of the time we would spend 4 hours a day out of the bungalow.
After putting up with the noise for several weeks, in an attempt to stop him, the neighbours reported Collins to the council for running an illegal business.
They just said that as far as they was concerned, Mr. Collins, it was a hobby.
We were absolutely flabbergasted. We could not see how they could class it as a hobby when we had lorry loads and van loads of wood coming and going.
The residents weren't prepared to accept the decision, though. In order to prove how big an issue the recycling was, Michael Pollard dusted off his family camera to play detective.
Mr. Collins was accepting a load of scrap pallets. I'd sit in the car, I could take pictures of him. You're putting yourself on the line, but nevertheless I felt I had to do it. If we were going to get a resolution to the problem, then evidence had got to be gathered.
Over the next 4 years, Mr. Pollard took countless photos and the case on Collins grew. Collins was aware the 3 families were watching him, but to their horror, one weekend did something quite unexpected.
It was a Sunday morning, nice sunny day, going out into the garden, and I could hear somebody banging at the back of my fence. And I went and had a look round. He got a hammer and chisel and he was chiselling all the bricks and the blocks out. He'd hammered and chiselled them away. I leaned over there, pointed the camera down the boundary. There was a big hole that he'd made at the bottom of the fence.
With his fence under attack, Michael called the police, but there was nothing they could do.
Wasted exercise. It got away with it.
But that was just the beginning of some very bizarre behaviour.
Mr. Collins from over there came out, started banging lids with his iron bar. I carried on, I cleaned my windows, and next thing I just couldn't believe what he was doing. As I looked at him and he turned round and dropped his trousers like that and started whittling his bottom at me.
He done the same old trick and pulled his mask, his stocking over his face, as if to say, oh, it weren't me.
And it wasn't just the noise and rudeness. Mr. Collins' actions began to increasingly unnerve his neighbours.
And he just stared. He also, on one occasion, had a big spotlight in his front bedroom, directed right to our lounge.
According to Mr. Collins, the only lights he had were the ones on his ceiling. But as far as the neighbours were concerned, Mr. Collins was spying on them.
Shirley over the road rang up and said, "What are you doing?" So I said, "Well, I'm having a wash getting me dressed." So she said, "Because Colin stands on the drive looking over your house with binoculars." And then I realised he was standing on the drive looking through this lounge window with his, and could see me going in and out the bathroom.
His answer to the police when we reported this incident was that he was using them for bird watching.
I'm angry about it because I'm in my own home while he's doing this. You can't even have privacy. This is my home and I should be able to do what I like in it without having him with binoculars spying on you all the time, watching you what you're doing.
Mr. Collins admitted he used binoculars and says had Mrs. Walne, in his words, been a looker, he'd have used them more. Coming up, Leslie Collins takes his campaign of intimidation out onto the street.
Mr. Collins came behind me in his car, 2 inches away from my legs. I felt sick, I felt nervous, and I felt frightened.
And in Scotland, 2 women's obsession with their dogs drive their neighbours over the edge.
I asked how many dogs is she expecting to bring down here? And he said, too many. The neighbours were going bananas.
The west coast of Scotland, all rugged peaks and wild coastline. The epitome of peace and tranquility. For 3 years, Colin Burns lived in a small Ayrshire community with beautiful views across the Firth of Clyde.
I moved in and basically started to renovate the property room by room. I never had any issues at all with the neighbours. It was very quiet. It was a nice place to stay.
But in April 2013, he made the decision to move and rent the house out.
I replied to an advert I found on the internet. There was 2 people looking for a property with at least 2 bedrooms, preferably with 2 outbuildings, in a semi-rural or rural location in Ayrshire.
Colin felt the dog lovers were the ideal tenants for his house and wasted no time signing up Fiona Hope and Janet Perry. He let his neighbours know about their imminent arrival to the community.
I told the neighbours that 2 women were moving in. I told them they had some dogs. One of the neighbours asked me what type of dogs they had. I said, I think they've had... she did tell me she had pug dogs, a couple of Rottweilers, and that was her show dogs, and her pug dog was called Arthur.
The 2 women asked if they could make modifications to the outbuildings before they moved in, and Colin agreed. But when he went to check on the work, alarm bells began to ring.
I went into the sheds. There I found 3 men putting up large 6-foot-high steel cages inside the sheds. I asked how many dogs is she expecting to bring down here? And he said, too many. Way too many. So at this point, I start to get a bit worried.
But the landlord wasn't the only one to be concerned by the work. Some of the neighbours had also noticed it, and according to Janet Perry, angrily confronted her as she arrived to oversee the renovations.
It was the day before Fiona had planned to move in. My dad had been down, and one of our neighbours had went up to the kennels up the back, saying that she wasn't happy that there was dogs coming on the property, and they could just take all the kennels back down because she wasn't having it.
Having expressed their opposition to Janet and Fiona moving in with their dogs, by moving day, the neighbours, who declined to tell their side of the story, confronted the new tenants head-on.
This is the access road that goes up to our property, but there was a car parked here. There was also a car parked across here. And there were 3 houses where the neighbours were out in the street. They were adamant that we weren't getting to go anywhere until they'd spoken to the landlord.
With the welcome far from warm, Janet attempted to smooth over what appeared to be an already doomed relationship.
I did try to talk to the neighbours to calm the situation down, but I was greeted with absolute horrendous language and abuse. And all the assumptions that they were making were on things that hadn't even happened, because there were no dogs on the property at this point in time.
And when the dogs did finally arrive, an already charged situation with the neighbours exploded.
Received a telephone call from one of the neighbours, and he informed me that Janet Perry and Fiona Hope had brought multiple Rottweilers to the property.
Come on!
He said the neighbours were going bananas.
Guys, enough! Settle down! Settle down!
With 22 dogs, including powerful breeds, there were clearly more than the couple of Rottweilers and a few pugs Colin had told the neighbours about.
Kenzie and Seamus, this is Eddie and Patsy and Riker, and this little girl on her own is Georgia.
For these 2 women, their dogs are their lives.
When I met Janet, I met her at a dog show. And we got chatting about the dogs and we kind of hit it off, and then we've been friends ever since.
The women have bred dogs for over 25 years. They place the canines in their care above anything else.
I would feed and care for my dogs before I would feed and care for myself. That sounds like really eccentric, and I suppose we could be classed as being eccentric.
I'm particular. I'm not eccentric. I'm just particular.
And Janet and Fiona are so crazy about their dogs, they even hold on to them when they've departed for a better place.
These are urns with dogs' ashes in them. These ones are all the Rotties. All the wooden ones are the Rotties. This one here was a little mongrel we adopted a few years ago that nobody wanted. We found them wandering the streets. So we keep them all. That is my intentions when I go, that they go with me. They'll go in the heck of a big coffin, but they'll go in the coffin and go with me, hopefully.
Oh, Riker. That's just not attractive.
They'd been in the property less than 24 hours, but it was already clear Janet and Fiona's relationship with their neighbours wasn't going to be an easy one. And after a first sleepless night, the neighbours wasted no time in making their complaints heard to landlord Colin.
Received a telephone call from one of the neighbours. He says they were howling from 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning.
But little did Colin know, this was just the start of a 6-month battle ahead, and he would be at the centre of it. In Leicestershire, Leslie Collins' 10-year campaign of threatening behaviour had led to his neighbour recording hours of footage as evidence against him.
All the problems that we had with Mr. Collins were taking over our daily life. We couldn't relax or think about anything else.
In an attempt to distance themselves from their neighbour, Mr. Pollard planted a barrier of conifers.
I could only put trees up to give us some peace from Mr. Collins. So I started from there all the way down the side of the lawn and then across the front.
But it didn't stop Mr. Collins.
And I just happened to be in my porch and I saw Mr. Collins chopping Mr. Pollard's trees.
Really, it was any time that we were away from the property, he'd see that as his opportunity to chop holes in the trees. Yeah, Mr. Collins got a big hole there between these two trees to look across the lawn and towards the drive. He's cut a massive hole here, so you can see when you're in bed there, that's the bedroom.
Mr. Collins claims he was merely pruning his neighbour's overgrown conifer.
He could stand there peering at you, pulling faces at you, bobbing his tongue out, like childish things all the time.
Clearly, there was no love lost between these neighbours. It would take 10 years and over 200 complaints to the police and council from the three couples before the authorities took action. Finally, an ASBO was issued in 2010, stopping Mr. Collins from having anything to do with the three families, cutting down their trees, making noise or throwing anything onto their properties. The neighbours hoped it would be the end of the problems, but they were sadly mistaken.
He didn't take any notice of the ASBO whatsoever.
Too many loopholes in it.
Yeah, it was written for him, really, to let him carry on.
And carry on he did.
This is the barbecue area, yeah. This is where we'd had the barbecue, the grandchildren there, my son there, and Collins would put his chair on top of his pile of pallets, the other side of that fence, and he'd be peering at us all the time. It's so long ago now, since we had a barbecue, it's 3 years or more, and it's all because of his actions.
Soon, Mr. Collins' scare tactics weren't confined to the street where they all lived.
It's every time you go out, you're looking over his shoulder. You go down the bottom of the road and you'd look up to see whether his car's moving.
Even a simple trip to the shops could turn into a nightmare.
I went to do my shopping and noticed Mr. Collins in the queue at the checkout.
Walking down the road, beautiful day, not a care in the world, quite relaxed. I got about here, I looked up that cul-de-sac and I recognised Collins's car. And I heard him start the engine.
Mr. Collins came behind me in his car, 2 inches away from my legs, and came behind me all the way back to the trolley park. I felt sick, I felt nervous, and I felt frightened.
I heard it coming along, rip-roaring down, and as I got here, I knew he was close, so I just stepped to one side behind this lamppost, and Collins come right alongside me. I was shaking.
And my legs were trembling. I got in the car. I didn't know how I could drive home.
It came later on, the shock.
And then when I drew out the car park, he came behind me. He frightened the life out of me.
Not content with intimidating his neighbours, visitors to the street also felt threatened.
We were just watching my son John and the 2 grandchildren walking up the road, and Mr. Collins came out his front door as they approached his lawn there, ran across his lawn or hurried across his lawn to confront him at the edge of the lawn there. And he's shouting abuse to the grandchildren. The wife shouted him. Shirley shouted from the front door, "You come home, leave your dad there to sort Collins out." And the son raised his fist. He said, "I'll hit you. If you don't pack it in, I'll hit you." But the wife shouted, "No, it's not worth it. If you hit him, you'll be the one that goes to prison." So the grandchildren rushed in the house, and Ella lay on the floor. She was so traumatised, and it was all because of the action of Mr. Collins. Well, it made us feel like prisoners in our own home, but what can you do? This was what Mr. Collins did.
By now, the Pollards and the other neighbours' relationship with Mr. Collins had reached rock bottom. But they had no idea that things were about to get even worse. Coming up, in Leicestershire, the the nightmare neighbour continues his campaign of intimidation.
Here it comes, look, straight over our fence. Look at that, disgusting.
And trouble's brewing in Scotland as the conflict escalates.
And then Fiona Hope started to be very rude, told me that it wasn't my house anymore. It was her house, and off.
Up in Western Scotland, in a small Ayrshire community, a noise dispute had residents complaining.
We're howling from 1 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 7 o'clock in the morning.
The complaints of constant barking from a 22-strong pack of dogs had resulted in warfare between Janet Hope, Fiona Perry and their neighbours.
This is what you get. This is what you get. This is what we have to put up with on a regular basis.
And only 3 days after the dogs had arrived, Janet and Fiona got a surprise visit when the environmental health turned up to see if the neighbours' claims were true.
I was actually up here with the dogs and it was about 11:30 and the 2 environmental health guys turned up at the door. They'd had a complaint about the noise. So I brought them in, I brought them through here and I said, well, you know, as you can hear, it's quiet. He asked if I still had the dogs on the premises. And I said, no, they're in their kennels. And he said, oh, for God's sake, tell them to go and boil their head.
And one of their main questions, I think, was, are the dogs barking continuously through the night?
And the answer was no.
And the answer is no, categorically no, because Fiona spent the first nights here
in that
actually
chair.
Sleeping in the kennels. Are not sleeping in the kennels, sitting in the kennels reading a book.
Janet and Fiona may have passed environmental health inspection, but they were left in no doubt as to who they felt was at fault.
Quite categorically, the landlord is to blame for this because he has lied to us, he's lied to the neighbours, he basically has lied to everybody. He led us to believe that everything was fine, the neighbours knew that the dogs were coming and there wasn't going to be a problem, and as far as the neighbours knew, we had 5 wee dogs and we weren't going to cause any problems.
But Colin disagreed with Janet and Fiona's point of view.
They tried to plead that they were being victimised. I felt lied to. I told Janet Perry I would let the neighbours know that they had some dogs, yes. Not 30 Rottweilers.
And it wasn't just relations between the tenants and their neighbours that hit rock bottom.
Tell me you love me. How much do you love me? Oh, big love me.
Landlord Colin was also at the sharp end of the villagers' rage.
I was getting shot from all angles from the neighbours because of a constant barrage of complaints. Blaming me for, this is your fault, bringing these idiots down here. I had decided that enough was enough already. I had no alternative at the time but to place a notice to quit.
Following the complaints from the neighbours, Colin's notice to quit was served just 2 weeks after his unpopular tenants moved in. In it, he stated he intended to repossess the property and move back in himself. Having served notice, he decided to visit his former home unannounced.
Knocked on the door. Janet Perry and Fiona Hope were actually trying to push a dog out the back door at the time.
Come on!
Then I said to them, how many bloody dogs have you got here? And she went, get out, you'll get in a minute, you'll get in a minute. Shut the door on me. So I went round to the front of the house. That's when I came into the front of the house. Fiona Hope was in the living room. And then Fiona Hope started to be very rude. Told me that it wasn't my house anymore. It was her house. Off.
It is mine, yes.
No, you didn't say it was your house. You said it was your home. You said it might be your house.
That's right.
But it's our home.
That was
the exact words that was
said.
said.
Own the house, but
it may be your house, but
here,
it's our home. And at least give us the courtesy of knocking the door before you walk in.
It wasn't just the dogs outside, but also the ones inside that worried Colin.
Had a look out in the conservatory, and there I saw about 6 dog cages in my conservatory on the floor. Felt really bad, I felt sick.
Does it look like there've been 5 or 6 dogs peeing and pooing all over the floor?
Other people have dogs in their houses. Dogs don't, unless, well, I have to say, if I brought one of my kennel dogs into the house, they may wee in the house. But dogs who live in the house, I assume are house trained.
It was clear to Colin just why the neighbours had become so angry.
If I lived there personally with the amount of dogs at that property, I think I'd be going I'd be demented. I think I'd be going off my head.
For Colin, it wasn't just the noise of the dogs that was clearly a problem. When he stepped out into his once beautiful garden, he was in for another shock.
Now, these people told me they would look after my property. They definitely have looked after it. Look at that. That is a mess.
This part of the garden here, and this part of the garden here, where the apple tree is, this did not get done by the dogs. I deliberately did this. I dug up all the old plants so I could plant new stuff.
The garden that's the one thing that he's commented on that I'm happy to hold my hands up to. His garden is a mess, but it's not destroyed, it's not beyond repair.
You couldn't write it. You couldn't make a story like this up. They've told you they're going to look after it. They've been totally led down the garden path. It is an absolute disgrace.
Colin may have been unhappy at how they treated his property, but Janet and Fiona were advised by a solicitor that the grounds on which he sought repossession were invalid.
Here you go. Kenzie, no.
They're saying, ooh,
Kenzie,
leave the baby alone.
Oh, she's baby
He's
mad.
got his stick.
She is baby mad.
Although their neighbours and Janet and Fiona's landlord wanted them out,
Out.
Come on.
Out. Yes, it's a baby, but it's not your baby.
the tenants decided to stay put. And as summer rolled on, they carried on with their daily lives.
They've been out, they've been fed, they've had a play, they've had their treats. Now they come back in, out, get their bedding cleaned out, and they'll go into their bed. I'll get the other ones out, get them fed, get them cleaned out.
As the weeks went by, the constant activity only fueled the neighbours' anger. And even more determined to get his tenants out, Colin decided to try and get rid of them one more time.
I received a phone call from one of the neighbours. She says, listen to this. And she held her mobile phone up outside her back door of her house. And all I could hear was dogs barking and yelping and making one hell of a racket.
The neighbours, who didn't want to speak on camera, told the local press that they'd barely slept in months due to the noise. But despite contacting police, Janet and Fiona were still there. While his tenants carried on with their lives,
We cook this every morning, pasta and meat, and they get their biscuits.
Colin was beginning to despair of the situation.
I'm feeling totally let down by departments that I'd contacted.
There we go, come on.
I'm feeling sorry for the neighbours. I'm feeling sorry for myself because I let these 2 tenants into the property.
Down. Wait. I didn't say speak down. Get down.
But the landlord was soon to feel even worse when 2 months after Janet and Fiona moved in, he began to receive complaints from their neighbours about a pungent new problem.
I go around the garden and pick up the dog poo. We put it initially into the wheelbarrow here, and the wheelbarrow's collected a couple of times a week.
Regarding the dog excrement, I had lots of phone calls regarding that. They had wheelbarrows of dog excrement in the back garden.
There was an allegation that we were disposing of a dog poo out the back, and we have out the back at the pond. We do have a straw pile where we dispose of the bedding. but not the dog poo. We had a complaint regarding it through the front.
And it stays covered over all the time. I don't uncover that until the guy's coming to take it away. That was one of the only things that the environmental health asked, because it was in the front garden, could we cover it up? So I took their advice and covered it up.
With the dogs getting up the neighbours' noses, quite literally, it would only be a matter of time before it wasn't only the landlord who was being threatened. In Leicestershire, Leslie Collins' 10-year campaign of threatening behaviour had led to his neighbour recording hours of footage as evidence against him.
All the problems that we had with Mr. Collins were taking over our daily life. We couldn't relax or think about anything else.
Next door, the Pollards had noticed Mr. Collins had started depositing something strange on their property.
Mr. Collins was putting concrete into Michael's guttering to block the guttering. The police kept saying, I can't see how Mr. Collins can do this. How can he do it? Is he coming on your property?
But it wasn't just concrete that was being deposited into their garden. Mr. Collins had created another rather unsavoury concoction.
I went out the back door and I said, God, there's a terrible smell. I said, it's just like somebody's chucked some urine over on the garden. I said, have you spilled something? Because I weren't sure that it were that. And he said, no, I've not been out yet. So I said, well, there's something not very nice on the back garden.
It would later become clear to the Pollards that Mr. Collins had made a mixture of human excrement, urine and motor oil and was throwing it into his neighbour's garden.
It used to come down onto the capping on the wall, onto the lawn, onto my bin, down the fence there, along that wall there, and then it used to splash along the footpath for about 3 metres down the path. I think it did it because, well, this is our bedroom, and it's also an area where the grandchildren play. They'll come down here on the scooter or the bike and come round the bungalow and go round and round, you see. So he did it, I think, for one reason, to try and stop them doing that. Well, enjoying life, really, enjoying being a child. It seemed to be a problem to him.
The police just said, well, did you see him do it? Did you see Mr. Collins do it? Have you got any witnesses that Mr. Collins did it? And of course they hadn't.
Extreme behaviour required the neighbours to fight back. Michael Pollard was determined to catch Mr. Collins in the act.
We've known what Mr. Collins has been doing over the years, but every time he got away with it, a lack of evidence, insufficient evidence, and I decided to put some quality 24-hour surveillance CCTV camera that would record it in sufficient detail that you could recognise who was doing it. And I decided to put it in when Mr. Collins was not present. Constantly looking over the road to see if Collins came back up the road.
I said he could come back any time. But as it were, he didn't, so he managed to put the camera up. And I said, well, is it going to be worth it?
But it was well worthwhile. Just a week later, Michael captured some shocking evidence.
Mr. Collins, the evil neighbour.
So what's he looking for?
He's looking for something, and he's looking for something to step on. There's our fence, and that's there off his wood pile. Now he stands up, looks over, the coast is clear, the bucket's in his hand, look. Yeah. Watch out, here it comes, look, straight over our fence. Look at that, disgusting. He's going back for another load.
The footage also solved the puzzle of the concrete, and it involved a homemade giant-sized ladle.
Down goes the concrete, down my drain. Who could dream of doing anything like that to your neighbour's property?
Following 10 years of complaints, there was now real evidence of Mr. Collins' antisocial behaviour, and he was summoned to court.
has got away with it so many times, we still believed it could get away with it. It could walk home with us again.
So I said, no, I won't think anything until we hear it in that court.
From the judge.
What he's got.
Leslie Collins denies mooning, making V signs or menacing the neighbours while out in his car. He also told us he's never given them any verbals. In fact, he claims the Walns, Pollards and Elliots invaded his privacy and subjected him to verbal and physical abuse, which the three couples obviously deny. However, in court, Mr. Collins pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to 34 months in prison for breaching his ASBO on 2 occasions, damaging property and running an illegal waste facility.
I felt like I wanted to jump up and shout, hooray, thank you, Judge. That's how I felt, but I didn't.
So once again, peace reigns in the neighbourhood.
Just to be able to be free, that's how I feel, free.
It's like a normal street again after so many years, yeah, and we hope it stays that way.
That is, until Mr. Collins' release from prison sometime soon. Coming up, in Scotland, Janet and Fiona suspect their neighbours of foul play.
The dogs can't defend themselves. The dogs can't speak up for themselves. And our only defence of the dogs now is to get them away to hell out of here.
Up in Ayrshire, war had broken out from the very moment new residents Janet Hope and Fiona Perry arrived.
Quite categorically, the landlord is to blame for this, but he basically has lied to everybody.
From the day the new residents moved in, complaints about noise and foul smells from their 22 dogs had left the neighbourhood at war.
I was getting shot from all angles from the neighbours because of a constant barrage of complaints.
The neighbours claimed dog excrement left outside of the house made the whole area stink.
I think it's a disgrace. I think it's extremely unhygienic. And for 2 women of their age, I think it's disgusting.
The foul smells were the final straw. Frustrated that Colin hadn't yet got the ladies out, the neighbours vented their anger at the landlord.
I was receiving some fantastic text messages and phone calls from neighbours complaining about the noise and about the tenants.
The villagers were to make it clear that Colin was no longer welcome in the area, and when he did return to visit, 2 cars were driven menacingly at him.
You nearly hit me, What are you doing? Did you get that?
The police were called and statements taken. Despite his previous attempt to get rid of his tenants failing, landlord Colin was determined to get them out, and in September 2013 he served a second notice to quit. But Janet and Fiona had suspicions people were trying to force them and their dogs out in other ways.
There was some raw meat lying just in here, at the corner. I've got a picture of it, you can have a wee look at. Now this actually, I found this really scary because over the 3 months previous we'd had several threats to actually poison the dogs.
Now believing themselves and their dogs to be in danger, and with a notice to quit hanging over them, Janet and Fiona had had enough.
I think it was the last of a long line of incidents. The dogs can't defend themselves. The dogs can't speak up for themselves. The dogs can't come to the door and say, Mum, that person's trying to give us something not very nice. We have to defend the dogs. They can't do it. And our only defence of the dogs now is to get them away to hell out of here.
By November 2013, only 5 months after they moved in, peace looked like it would once again return to this Scottish community.
I don't have the energy to fight them anymore. I'm absolutely exhausted.
Janet and Fiona decided to move their lives on, but were still feeling like victims.
Just having to sort everything out again and put everything back in boxes and transport it to somewhere else, it's a huge undertaking.
The thought of people would treat me like this is just horrific. If I'm a neighbour for hell, I'm certainly not the only one in this block to be a neighbour for hell. I know if they be bluntly honest, they cannot say that I have stood and I have threatened them or shouted at them or sworn at them or done anything that would justify them calling me a neighbour for hell.
But after a bitter 5-month war involving some of their neighbours, Colin saw the situation rather differently.
Regarding the neighbours shouting and bawling, I think there's always two sides to every story. Often there are three sides to every story. You'll get one side, another side, and the truth somewhere in the middle. If I would have actually known how many dogs actually were brought to that property, there'd be no way on earth I would have rented that property out to Janet Perry and Fiona Hall. They're claiming to be the victim, but they've actually caused a lot of trouble.
The two women and their dogs have now moved to an undisclosed address. We've yet to hear what their new neighbours think of them. Across the UK, it seems there are plenty of us involved in some sort of dispute with our neighbours.
There are neighbours now who will cross to avoid us, neighbours who would have walked up and down now drive up and down so that they don't run the risk of bumping into us.
There wasn't a load of aggravation from day one, it was just incidents started building up over a period of time.
It can be anything from complaints about noise.
I stood here, she was stood at a door, and I says to her, "Can you stop banging? You've knocked the light fitting down." She looked at me, she goes, "Kids, what do you expect?" And she slammed the door, and as she did so, she shouted, "Off."
It could go on while 10, 11, 12, sometimes beyond midnight. You couldn't sleep.
To never-ending building work.
It makes me feel totally claustrophobic, and I literally feel like the walls are coming in on me.
When I saw the plans for the basement, it stated that it was going to be a laundry area. And when I spoke to one of the contractors, he said, "Oh no, darling, it's a cinema."
Problems with neighbours obsessed by animals.
Our pets are more important than our neighbours. Our pets are like a family to us.
And you're like, there it goes again. And you can't get away from it.
I think badgers were a greater priority to me than being part of the community.
Or even disagreements over money.
They'd taken all this money from us, and all because we thought we were helping somebody.
Some disputes can get menacing and nasty.
He'd got his spade, and the next minute I knew it had hit me on the arm.
He was coming up the drive here with blood all over his arm, and it was dripping onto the drive here.
I'm not saying it's right to retaliate, but there's only so much abuse anybody can take before they reach their breaking point.
She just punched me in the face, and I just got really angry.
He's threatened to blow our house up. He's threatened to put bricks through our window.
Many neighbours desperately try to stand their ground.
We're spying on people, we're getting evidence.
I told them both to get off my property and stay off my property.
In the end, though, most will get resolved.
And he gave me an out-of-court settlement of £30,000 in damages and £7,500 in legal costs.
We got him in the end. We got him in the end.
But there are some who are still stuck with their nightmare neighbour next door.
Have
you been the victim of a nightmare neighbour, or has your neighbour complained about your behaviour? If you'd like to tell us your story, go to channel5.com/nightmare neighbours. Next tonight, new GPs behind closed doors.